The world of Bronze Age Greece was not loud in the way people imagine ancient power to be. It did not always announce itself with marching armies or burning cities. Much of it moved quietly, carried by wind across the sea, by oars dipping into dark water, by voices exchanged in harbours at dawn. Long before the idea of Greece became a single story, it was a scattered constellation of islands, ports, valleys, and rising stone centres, each connected more by water than by land. The sea was not a border here. It was a road. Across this watery world, palaces rose in places that felt both chosen and inevitable. They stood above fertile plains, beside protected harbours, near mountain passes that guided trade inland. From a distance, they appeared calm and permanent, their walls catching sunlight, their courtyards holding shade. Inside, however, they were alive with motion. Scribes bent over tablets, pressing symbols into wet clay. Storekeepers counted jars of oil and grain. Messengers moved between rooms carrying news from ships, fields, and distant allies. Priests prepared offerings for gods who were felt more than seen. Everything flowed inward and outward through these centres, like breath through lungs. These palaces were not only places of rule, they were places of balance. They kept order between people and seasons, between hunger and harvest, between fear and belief. They held food in times of abundance and released it in times of need. They hosted rituals that tied the visible world to something beyond it. They settled disputes, arranged marriages, sealed alliances, and recorded promises. To live near a palace was to live near the heart of things. Yet the world beyond the palace walls was just as alive. Farmers rose before the sun, walking into fields that had been worked by the same families for generations. Fishermen pushed boats into quiet waters, trusting the rhythms of tide and moon. Artisans shaped metal, clay, and stone into tools, ornaments, and images whose meanings were both practical and sacred. Songs were sung that had no author and no beginning, only memory. Trade wove all of this together. Ships moved constantly between islands and coasts, carrying copper from Cyprus, tin from distant lands, dyes, spices, cloth, wine, stories, and rumours. Every harbour was a meeting place of languages and customs. Every ship carried not only goods but ideas. A new style of pottery here, a new ritual there, a new way of naming the stars overhead. From within this flowing world, the palaces appeared solid, steady, dependable. They seemed like anchors holding everything in place. They were built to last. Their stones were thick. Their foundations were deep. Their records were meant to preserve memory itself, and this is why their endings usually leave scars. When a palace fell in war, the ground remembered, walls collapsed inward, roof beams burned and turned to ash. Arrowheads were buried in earth beside shattered bones. Clay tablets baked hard in fire, frozen with their final lists of supplies and names. Destruction left a signature that could be read centuries later, and because of that, those endings remain visible. But not all palaces ended this way. Some did not burn, some did not fall, some did not collapse under invasion or disaster. Some simply stopped being used, and this is the unease that settles quietly into this story. Because a palace is not easy to abandon. It is a structure built from effort, belief, labour, and trust layered over generations. To walk away from it is to walk away from a system that organises life itself. It means choosing something unknown over something stable. It means loosening a bond that once felt necessary. And yet, somewhere in this ancient world, that choice was made. Not loudly, not violently, not with banners or speeches, but slowly, almost gently, as if people began to drift rather than depart. Fewer ships arrived, fewer goods were stored, fewer rituals were performed. The courtyards became quieter. The rooms echoed a little longer after footsteps passed through them. Nothing was broken, nothing was destroyed, and nothing was taken by force, and still the palace faded. This absence is more unsettling than any ruin. It resists simple explanation. It does not fit the pattern of conquest or collapse. It does not match the stories we expect history to tell us about endings. The world around the palace continued. Fields were still planted, children were still born. Trade still flowed, though perhaps along different paths. Belief still existed, though perhaps shaped differently. Life did not stop. It simply reorganized itself. And so the palace, once central, became peripheral, then unnecessary, then invisible. Today, when people look back toward the Bronze Age, they see a world of wonders and disasters, of rising cultures and sudden falls. They see dramatic arcs carved into stone and memory. But beneath that familiar story lies something quieter and stranger. A place that should have left a mark did not. A center that should have been remembered was not. It did not disappear because it failed. It disappeared because it was no longer needed. This is where the story truly begins. Not with a battle and not with a catastrophe, but with a question that feels almost uncomfortable in its softness. How does something so important become unnecessary? How does something so central slip away without a sound? And what kind of world must exist for that to happen? To answer that, we have to move closer, narrowing our attention from the wide sea of Bronze Age Greece toward one specific place, a palace that does not behave like the others, a palace that did not end but dissolved, a palace that left no wound for history to trace, only a silence that waits to be noticed. The palace is not introduced with a name, because names give things weight, and this place has already begun to lose its weight in history. It is first felt as a location, a presence in the landscape rather than a label on a map. It sits where land and sea quietly meet, where hills descend into plains and plains soften into harbours. It is positioned perfectly, in a way that suggests intention rather than accident, as if someone once stood here and understood that this was a place where people would gather, trade, speak, worship, and rule. Everything about the site suggests importance. Everything about its setting implies that it should have been fought over. In the Bronze Age world, location was power. Control the harbour, and you controlled movement. Control the plains, and you controlled food. Control the crossroads, and you controlled exchange. This palace held all three. Ships would have approached its shores regularly. Caravans would have passed nearby. Messengers would have carried news to and from its gates. It should have been a prize, something that neighbouring powers desired, envied, and eventually tried to take. History teaches us to expect that such places do not end quietly. They attract attention, and attention often brings conflict. And so when archaeologists search for palaces, they search first for destruction. They expect to find walls blackened by fire, beams collapsed inward, layers of ash sealing moments of panic into the earth. They expect to uncover arrowheads lodged in stone, blades broken near doorways, skeletons scattered where people fell while trying to escape. They expect signs of siege, of burning, of sudden interruption. These are the fingerprints of violent endings, and they are common enough to feel almost normal in the story of ancient power. But here, those fingerprints are missing. The walls are not burned. The floors are not littered with weapons. The bones are not piled in corners or pressed into doorways. There is no layer of ash that marks a final night of fire. There is no thick line in the soil that says, this is where everything stopped. Instead, there is only space. Rooms that are intact but empty. Corridors that lead nowhere because no one walks them anymore. Storage areas that once held abundance and now hold only dust. It is not the presence of something terrible that defines this place, but the absence of anything at all. This is what makes the palace unsettling. Because power does not usually release its grip gently. Power resists being taken, and it resists being abandoned. It builds defenses. It builds symbols. It builds stories around itself to make leaving feel unthinkable. A palace is not only stone and structure. It is agreement. It is hierarchy. It is belief made visible. To walk away from it is not only to leave a building, but to leave a way of organizing life itself. And yet, someone did. Not suddenly, and not in fear, but slowly, as if the palace began to feel less necessary than it once had. Perhaps fewer ships docked at its harbour. Perhaps fewer goods passed through its storerooms. Perhaps fewer people felt the need to bring disputes, offerings, or questions to its gates. None of this would have felt dramatic at the time. It would have felt practical, ordinary. Small decisions made by individuals that added up to something much larger. A merchant chooses a different port. A family settles closer to a field than to a palace wall. A ritual is performed in a village instead of a courtyard. A leader solves a problem locally instead of sending word upward. Nothing collapses, nothing breaks. But the palace begins to lose its role, and without a role, it begins to lose its reason to exist. This is why the idea of intentional abandonment is so strange and so quiet at the same time. It does not feel like an event, it feels like a drift. Like watching a shoreline recede without noticing that the tide has changed. By the time anyone realizes what is happening, it has already happened. And so the palace becomes a ghost, without ever dying. It is still there, physically. Its stones remain stacked, its walls still trace their original lines. But no one lives inside it, no one fills it with voices or movement or meaning. It becomes a shell, and then a memory, and then a question. Why was it left? History offers no simple answer, because history is built to remember moments of rupture, not moments of release. It remembers fire better than fading. It remembers noise better than silence. It remembers endings that hurt, not endings that simply arrive. This palace does not fit the shape of a tragedy, and so it does not fit easily into the stories we tell about the past. It is too calm to be a disaster, too empty to be a victory, too quiet to be a legend. It exists in a space that history does not know how to name, and that is why it becomes mysterious. Not because it hides secrets behind walls, but because it hides its meaning in absence. It forces us to ask questions that feel almost uncomfortable in their gentleness. What does it mean when people choose to leave power behind? What does it mean when a society decides, without announcement, that it no longer needs what once defined it? What does it mean when something ends without being destroyed? The palace is not a story of conquest. It is a story of choice. A choice made collectively, unconsciously, over time. A choice that no one recorded because no one thought it mattered. A choice that did not feel like history in the moment, but only like life continuing in a slightly different direction. And so the palace slipped out of use, the way a word slips out of language. Not erased, not forbidden, not censored, but slowly replaced by other words, other needs, other meanings. Until one day, it was no longer spoken at all. This is why its silence feels so loud now. Because it reminds us that history is not only shaped by what happens, but by what quietly stops happening. It is shaped by attention as much as by action, by forgetting as much as by remembering. And sometimes, the most important changes leave the smallest traces. The palace stands at the edge of that realization, a structure that invites us not to witness its fall, but to notice its absence. And in doing so, it draws us toward a deeper question, one that reaches beyond stone and soil and into the nature of power itself. Before we can understand why it was abandoned, we have to understand what it truly was, how it worked, and why people once believed they needed it at all. The palace was never just a building. Stone walls and painted halls were only its outer skin. What truly mattered was the invisible structure inside it, the slow, patient system that turned human effort into order and order into stability. The palace was a living machine, built not from gears or metal but from habits, trust, belief, and repetition. Every day, it absorbed the labor of thousands of people and returned it in forms that made life predictable enough to continue. At the most visible level, the palace managed food. Farmers worked fields that stretched beyond the horizon, planting and harvesting grain, olives, grapes, and vegetables in rhythms set by seasons and rain. A portion of that harvest moved toward the palace. It arrived in baskets, jars, sacks, and carts, and it was counted, recorded, and stored. Scribes marked symbols into clay tablets, pressing the story of abundance into soft earth so it could harden into memory. Nothing here was random. Every jar had a place. Every quantity had meaning. The palace became a memory that never forgot. This stored food did not sit idle. It moved again, flowing outward to support artisans, builders, priests, messengers, guards, and the elderly. It fed people who were not growing their own food, allowing society to become more complex than simple survival. In this way, the palace turned surplus into specialization. It allowed some people to shape metal instead of soil, to weave cloth instead of plough fields, to observe the stars instead of watch the weather. Culture itself was built on this quiet exchange. Labor followed a similar pattern. The palace organized work, not always by command, but by expectation. People knew what was needed because they had always known. They repaired walls, cleared canals, maintained roads, built ships, crafted tools, and trained apprentices. The palace did not need to shout. It only needed to exist, and people oriented themselves around it like plants around light. Belief was woven into this system just as deeply as food and labor. Rituals were not separate from daily life. They were the frame that gave it meaning. Offerings were brought not only to honor the gods, but to affirm that the world was still in balance. The palace stood as a bridge between visible and invisible order. It said, quietly, that someone was watching, someone was counting, someone was keeping the world from slipping into chaos. Authority flowed from this role. Leaders did not rule because they were strongest, but because they stood at the center of this exchange. They controlled storage, distribution, ritual, and record. They knew who had given, who had received, who owed, and who waited. Power here was not always force. It was coordination. This made the palace feel solid, but in truth, it was fragile. It depended on participation. Farmers had to bring their harvest. Scribes had to record honestly. Leaders had to distribute fairly. Priests had to perform rituals convincingly. If any part weakened, the whole system felt strain. If too much food was taken and not enough returned, trust faded. If records were manipulated, resentment grew. If rituals lost their meaning, belief dissolved. The palace did not survive because it was defended by walls. It survived because people believed in the pattern it created. It survived because it made life make sense. This is what makes its disappearance so unsettling. When people imagine collapse, they imagine destruction. But this system could collapse without a single stone moving. All it required was that people stop feeding it, stop believing in it, stop needing it. A merchant who traded elsewhere removed a thread from the web. A farmer who kept more grain at home loosened the palace's hold. A village that solved its own problems stepped slightly outside the system. None of these acts were rebellion. They were adaptation. They were choices made for convenience, survival, or comfort. But over time, they drained energy from the center. The palace could not force people to participate without becoming something else entirely. It could not remain a shared system and become a coercive one at the same time. Its power existed only as long as people agreed it should, and slowly, that agreement faded. Perhaps trade routes shifted. Perhaps new technologies made local storage easier. Perhaps belief became more personal, less tied to grand rituals. Perhaps political alliances made distant centers more attractive than nearby ones. Each change alone was small. Together, they altered the flow of life. The palace was built to manage a certain kind of world. When that world changed, the palace did not know how to follow, and so it stood still. At first, it felt like stability. Then, it felt like delay. Then, it felt like irrelevance. The palace did not fall because it was attacked. It fell because it was bypassed. The world simply grew around it, like water flowing around a stone. This is why the palace is best understood not as a ruin, but as a system that outlived its purpose. Its walls remained, but its function dissolved. Its form survived, but its meaning drifted away. Understanding this changes the entire story. The palace was not a victim. It was a solution to a problem that no longer existed. When that problem disappeared, the solution quietly followed. This is why its ending feels gentle and disturbing at the same time. It suggests that power does not always die dramatically. Sometimes it simply becomes unnecessary. And this realization leads naturally to the deeper question waiting ahead. If the palace was once essential and then became irrelevant, what changed in the world that made this possible? What forces reshaped trade, belief, and identity so deeply that an entire system could be left behind without a fight? To understand the palace's disappearance, we now have to look outward, beyond its walls, into the wider currents that slowly redirected the course of life itself. The first signs of change were so small that no one at the time would have called them important. They did not arrive as announcements or warnings. They arrived as absences. A storeroom that once held 10 rows of jars now held 8. A shipment that once arrived every season now came every other year. A roof that needed repair waited a little longer than it used to. None of this felt like decline. It felt like adjustment. The palace still stood. Its walls were not cracked. Its gates were not broken. Its halls still echoed when footsteps crossed them. From a distance, nothing appeared wrong. Yet, inside, the rhythms that once animated the place began to slow. Scribes still pressed symbols into clay, but there were fewer symbols to press. Storekeepers still counted goods, but the numbers were smaller. Messengers still came and went, but the news they carried felt less urgent, less necessary. Archaeology notices these things long after they happen. It sees fewer storage jars stacked in the corners of rooms. It sees unfinished repairs where a wall was reinforced once, then never again. It sees imported objects growing rare, replaced by local ones or by nothing at all. These traces do not point to a single moment of failure. They point to a gradual thinning, as if the palace was slowly losing weight. This kind of change is difficult to recognize because it does not resemble collapse. There is no disaster layer in the soil. There is no sudden break between before and after. Instead, there is a soft slope downward, a long descent that feels level while it is happening. People do not notice they are leaving something behind when they are still standing near it. The palace did not empty in a day. It did not empty in a year. It emptied in habits. A merchant chose another harbour because it was closer. A village stored more grain locally because it felt safer. A ritual was held at home because it felt more meaningful. These choices were practical, not political. They were personal, not ideological. But they changed the shape of the world. Trade routes shifted first, because trade is always restless. It follows convenience, profit, safety, and speed. If another port became easier to reach, ships drifted toward it. If another centre offered better terms, merchants preferred it. The palace did not lose trade because it failed, but because something else worked slightly better. Over time, slightly better becomes simply normal. Belief shifted more quietly. Rituals that once felt essential began to feel optional. The gods did not vanish, but the way people related to them changed. Faith moved from grand spaces into small ones, from formal offerings into personal gestures. Meaning became local. The palace no longer felt like the only bridge between human and divine. Authority changed with belief. Leaders who once spoke from central halls now spoke from within communities. Decisions were made closer to the people they affected. Problems were solved without sending messengers upward. This did not feel like rebellion. It felt like efficiency. It felt like maturity. It felt like learning to live without asking permission. None of this required anyone to declare that the palace was no longer needed. No one stood in the courtyard and announced an ending. The palace was not rejected. It was outgrown. This is what makes the palace's decline so strange. It was not pushed out. It was left behind. From the inside, this would not have felt like loss. It would have felt like freedom. Less travel, less waiting, less dependence on distant decisions. Life became smaller, but also more immediate, more intimate, more human. From the outside, however, it looks like starvation. The palace depended on flow. Goods had to move inward and outward. People had to arrive and depart. Belief had to circulate. When that flow slowed, the palace became hollow. It was still there, but it was no longer connected. A system cannot survive without movement. It is not enough for it to stand. It must be used. And so the palace began to resemble a heart that still beats, but no longer receives blood. It is alive in form, but fading in function. The change was not dramatic enough to record, and so it was not recorded. There was no crisis to document, no enemy to name, no victory to celebrate. There was only a long season of less activity, less noise, less reason. This is why the palace feels like it disappeared without a story. Its story was made of tiny choices that felt too ordinary to matter. But ordinary choices shape history more than extraordinary ones ever could. By the time anyone might have noticed that the palace was no longer central, it was already no longer central. By the time anyone might have tried to revive it, there was no longer a reason to do so. The world had reorganized itself. And so the palace faded the way a song fades when people stop singing it. Not because it is forbidden, not because it is wrong, but because other songs have taken its place. This is the moment where the story becomes less about the palace and more about the world around it. The palace is not the cause of change. It is the mirror that reveals it. Its silence tells us that something else has begun to speak. To understand the palace's withdrawal, we must now turn our attention outward. We must follow the shifting routes, the changing beliefs, the the new centers of life and meaning that quietly pulled people away from the old one. Only then can we see not just why the palace faded, but what replaced it, and what kind of world made its disappearance possible. The world beyond the palace was never still. Even while its walls remained unchanged, the sea kept moving, the winds kept turning, and people kept adjusting their paths in quiet, practical ways. Change did not arrive as a storm. It arrived as a drift. For generations, ships had followed familiar routes across the Aegean. They moved between islands, along coasts, into harbours that felt safe and profitable. These routes were shaped by currents, by seasonal winds, by the rise and fall of local powers, and by the simple human desire for easier journeys. No one planned these shifts. They happened because the world itself was always rearranging its smallest details. A harbour that once felt central could become inconvenient if a new port offered better shelter from storms. A route that once felt safe could become risky if piracy rose or alliances changed. A palace that once stood at the crossroads of exchange could find itself standing just slightly to the side of it. This, slightly, was enough. Merchants followed advantage the way water follows gravity. If goods moved faster elsewhere, they moved elsewhere too. If costs were lower somewhere else, trade bent in that direction. No one needed to abandon the palace intentionally. They only needed to choose something marginally better. And over time, marginal choices become massive change. Goods that once filled palace storerooms now passed through different hands. Copper, tin, cloth, oil, wine, and grain found new routes, new intermediaries, new resting places. The palace did not lose trade because it was rejected. It lost trade because the world discovered other ways to move. As this happened, new centers quietly rose, not as replacements, but as alternatives. A smaller port that served a narrower region more efficiently, a coastal town that sat closer to a profitable route, an inland hub that connected valleys without requiring long sea journeys. None of these places needed to become grand to become important. They only needed to be useful. And usefulness is a powerful force. This is what makes the palace's decline feel strange when viewed from the outside. It was not pushed down by enemies. It was outpaced by convenience. The palace remained impressive. Its walls still stood. Its halls still existed. But the flow of life no longer passed through them. The river had not dried. It had changed its course. Power moved with it. This is an uncomfortable truth about history. Power does not always collapse. Sometimes it migrates. Sometimes it slips away quietly, following currents no one controls. The palace's authority was once tied to its position in a network. When that network reshaped itself, the palace did not lose power in a dramatic sense. It lost relevance. And relevance is what sustains power in the long term. Political relationships shifted alongside trade. Alliances changed. New partnerships formed. Old rivalries cooled or moved elsewhere. Leaders began looking outward rather than inward. Decisions that once passed through palace halls were now made closer to the places they affected. This was not chaos. It was adaptation. The world was becoming more fluid, more distributed, less dependent on singular centers. The palace had been designed for a world that was more static, more predictable, more centralized. When that world changed, the palace remained what it had always been. It simply no longer matched its environment. This is why the palace feels like it faded rather than fell. It was not defeated by a stronger force. It was bypassed by a softer one. And that softness is what makes it difficult to notice. There is no single moment when everything changes. There is no event to point to. There is only a long sequence of choices that all feel reasonable in isolation. This is how invisible change works. A ship docks somewhere else because the water is calmer. A trader signs a deal elsewhere because the terms are better. A leader travels elsewhere because the influence has shifted. A family moves elsewhere because the land is richer. None of this feels political. It feels practical. But practicality reshapes the world more deeply than ideology ever could. Over time, the palace becomes a place people pass by rather than pass through. It becomes peripheral, and peripheral things slowly lose meaning. This does not mean the palace was wrong. It means it was right for a world that no longer existed. And this reframing changes how we think about endings. The palace did not fail. It completed its role in a specific configuration of the world. When that configuration changed, the palace became something else, a relic of an older pattern. This is what makes the story feel gentle and unsettling at the same time. There is no villain. There is no catastrophe. There is only movement. The sea shifts, trade shifts, power shifts, meaning shifts. And the palace, rooted in stone, cannot follow. So it remains where it is, watching the world rearrange itself around it, until one day it is no longer at the center of anything at all. It becomes a memory before it becomes a ruin. And that memory is not marked by destruction, but by absence. This realization prepares us for the next part of the story, because if the world outside the palace was changing this deeply, then the world inside people's minds must have been changing too. Trade and power are not only external forces, they reflect what people value, what they trust, and what they believe is worth following. To understand the palace's disappearance, we must now turn inward, toward the shifts in belief, identity, and social meaning that mirrored these external changes and made them feel natural rather than frightening. As the outer world shifted, something quieter was also changing within people themselves. Trade routes and political influence move across maps, but belief moves through hearts, and its paths are harder to trace. The palace had once drawn its deepest power not from its walls or its wealth, but from its meaning. It stood as a symbol of order in a world that often felt uncertain. It was the place where human effort met divine approval, where rituals aligned seasons, and where the invisible world was thought to touch the visible one. For generations, this symbolic role made the palace feel necessary, even when it was not convenient. People traveled long distances to bring offerings, to witness ceremonies, to settle disputes under what felt like a sacred roof. The palace was not just where decisions were made, it was where decisions felt justified. But belief, like trade, is not fixed. It evolves as people change, as circumstances shift, as new needs arise. Over time, the palace's rituals began to feel less essential to daily life. The gods did not vanish, but their presence felt closer, less tied to specific places. Prayer became personal, meaning moved inward. The bridge between divine and human no longer needed to be built from stone. At the same time, social bonds were changing shape. Families, villages, and small communities grew more self-reliant. They learned to solve problems locally, to negotiate directly, to support one another without referring everything upward. This did not feel like rebellion. It felt like growing up. When a village can manage its own food, resolve its own conflicts, and perform its own rituals, a distant palace begins to feel abstract. It becomes a symbol rather than a tool. And symbols are fragile when their stories stop being told. Authority followed belief. It moved from institutions into relationships. Trust became personal rather than hierarchical. Leadership became something someone did, not something someone occupied. This did not create disorder. It created intimacy, and intimacy reshaped meaning. The palace's halls still stood. Its stones still marked the landscape, but the emotional gravity that once pulled people toward it weakened. People no longer felt that life passed through the palace. Life passed beside it. This is the moment where the palace truly became empty. Not physically, but symbolically. And symbolic emptiness is more final than physical ruin. A burned building can be rebuilt. A broken wall can be repaired. But a place that has lost its meaning has no reason to be restored. This is what makes the palace's disappearance feel haunting rather than tragic. It was not destroyed. It was released. People did not stop believing in the world. They stopped believing that the world required that specific form. This shift was not dramatic enough to record, but it was profound enough to reshape history. It meant that power no longer needed a center, meaning no longer needed a monument. Identity no longer needed a throne. The palace became optional, and optional things eventually become invisible. This transformation created a new kind of world, a world with many small centers instead of one large one, a world where meaning lived in homes, in gatherings, in shared labor, in personal belief. It was quieter, more fragmented, but also more resilient. This is the world that grew where the palace once stood, not in its shadow, but in its absence. And that absence was not a void. It was a space where new forms of life could emerge, where authority could soften, where meaning could diversify. where people could become the center of their own stories. This is what replaced the palace. Not another building, and not another throne, but a different way of living. And this is why the palace did not leave a scar in the earth when it faded. It left a shift in the human landscape instead. The stones remained. The system dissolved. The walls stood. The meaning moved. This is the quiet truth hidden beneath the palace's silence, that when belief leaves a building, the building becomes only stone. And when belief finds a new home, history follows it. Now, with the palace no longer anchoring life, we can finally see what kind of world formed in its absence, how power reassembled itself in smaller forms, and how people reshaped their lives once the center dissolved into many beginnings. When the palace faded from the center of life, nothing rushed in to replace it. There was no new monument, no larger throne, no brighter symbol to take its place. Instead, the space it left behind was quietly filled by many smaller things. Villages grew slightly in importance. Families grew slightly in independence. Local gatherings began to matter more than distant halls. Power did not disappear. It spread. Where once people had looked inward toward a single center, they now looked sideways toward one another. A village became a place not only of residence, but of decision. A gathering became not only a social event, but a moment where problems were solved, resources were shared, and meaning was created. Leadership did not vanish. It softened. It became personal. It became familiar. In this new world, no one ruled from above. People led from within. This did not make life easier. It made life steadier. The palace had been efficient, but it had also been fragile. It concentrated food, authority, belief, and coordination into one place. When that place weakened, everything connected to it felt the strain. By contrast, the new network of smaller centers did not shine as brightly, but it could not fail all at once. If one village struggled, another could help. If one harvest failed, another succeeded. If one leader made poor choices, others offered different ones. Resilience replaced spectacle. This kind of power does not look impressive in stone. It looks ordinary in daily life. It looks like shared labor in a field. It looks like neighbors repairing a roof together. It looks like elders settling disputes under trees rather than in halls. It looks like children learning skills from parents instead of from institutions. None of this leaves monuments behind, but all of it leaves continuity. This is what makes decentralized life so hard to see from a distance and so powerful from within. It does not announce itself, it simply persists. Over time, the absence of the palace became less noticeable than its presence once had been. People stopped comparing their lives to what they used to be. They stopped feeling that something was missing. They began to feel that life was simply what it was. And in that acceptance, a new kind of stability emerged. It was not the stability of control, but the stability of adaptation. Each small center adjusted to its own environment. Coastal communities became experts in fishing and navigation. Inland villages refined agriculture and land management. Mountain settlements focused on herding and protection. Knowledge became local, precise, and deeply connected to place. Instead of one system trying to manage everything, many systems learned how to manage themselves. This created diversity, and diversity created strength. Where once a single failure could ripple outward through the entire system, now failures were contained. A drought affected one region, not all. A conflict disturbed one valley, not every coast. Life became more uneven, but also more survivable. The palace had offered unity. The new world offered multiplicity. Unity is powerful, but multiplicity is durable. This is why the palace's disappearance can be reframed not as a loss, but as a release into complexity. The world became less orderly and more alive. And in becoming more alive, it became harder to erase. There is something deeply unsettling and deeply comforting about this shift. Unsettling, because it means that great structures are not necessary for human life to continue. Comforting, because it means that human life does not depend on great structures to survive. People did not need a palace to live meaningful lives. They needed one another. And when they realized this, even unconsciously, the palace became less important than the relationships it once organized. It dissolved into them. This is what it means for the palace to become invisible. Not that it vanished from the landscape, but that it vanished from attention. It no longer shaped choices. It no longer framed identity. It no longer defined what felt possible. Life moved on without asking permission. And that is the quietest revolution of all. It leaves no ruins. It leaves no scars. It leaves no legends of heroes or villains. It leaves only a changed world that does not remember being different. This is why the palace feels like a ghost. Not because it haunts the present, but because it no longer belongs to it. The world it served no longer exists. The world that replaced it does. And that world is made not of stone and hierarchy, but of people and places, connected loosely, adapting constantly, resilient, precisely because it is not held together too tightly. This understanding prepares us to look closer at daily life, inside this new system, to feel how ordinary existence changed when power moved closer to home, when meaning became intimate, and when the grand story of civilization was rewritten as 1,000 smaller ones unfolding at once. After the palace faded from daily life, people did not wake up to a different world. They woke up to the same sun, the same fields, the same sea. But slowly, almost without noticing, they began to live differently inside that familiar landscape. Without a central authority managing food, labor, and ritual, individuals and families took on more responsibility for shaping their own lives. This did not feel like a burden. It felt like ownership. Food was no longer something that passed through distant storerooms before returning to tables. It was something that moved directly from field to family, from net to fire, from hand to hand. People stored what they could. They shared when they needed to. Surplus became local rather than centralized. Scarcity became something to solve together rather than something to report upward. Work changed shape as well. There were no longer large projects organized from a distant center. There were smaller projects organized where they mattered. A roof was repaired when it leaked. A path was cleared when it was blocked. A boat was built when a family needed one. Work became responsive rather than scheduled, practical rather than symbolic. Ritual followed the same pattern. It moved from courtyards into homes, from priests into parents, from calendars into seasons. People marked births, deaths, harvests, storms, and journeys in ways that felt personal and meaningful. Faith did not disappear. It became intimate. With this intimacy came a new sense of identity. People were no longer primarily subjects of a palace or members of a kingdom. They were members of a village, a family, a place. Belonging became geographical and relational rather than political. It was tied to faces, not to walls. This made life quieter. Not empty, but calm. There were fewer grand gatherings, fewer ceremonies that drew crowds from far away, fewer moments when thousands of people stood together under one roof. But there were more small gatherings, more shared meals, more conversations that lasted into the evening, more moments of recognition and care. People traded spectacle for stability. This was not a utopia. There were still conflicts, still failures, still loss, but problems felt closer and therefore more solvable. When something went wrong, it did not disappear into a system. It remained present, and people remained responsible for it. This responsibility was not imposed. It emerged. And with it came a sense of agency that had not existed before. Life felt less managed and more lived. The palace had once organized time, resources, and meaning. Now people organized these things themselves, imperfectly but honestly. There were mistakes, but there was also learning. There were tensions, but there was also growth. The world became less orderly and more human. And humans are messy, but they are also adaptable. This adaptability became the foundation of the new world. It did not rely on perfection. It relied on participation. This is why the palace could fade without being mourned. Not because it was unloved, but because it was no longer needed. Life had found another way to sustain itself. And that way was not grand enough to be remembered, but it was real enough to last. This creates a strange reversal in how we think about history. We tend to remember the structures, the buildings, the institutions. We forget the lives that moved through them. When those structures vanish quietly, it feels like something has been lost. But from the inside, something may have been gained. People gained proximity. They gained voice. They gained influence over their own lives. They did not replace a palace with another palace. They replaced it with themselves. This is why the palace's disappearance left so little trace. Because what replaced it did not leave ruins. It left habits. It left relationships. It left ways of living that were passed from person to person, rather than carved into stone. This is also why history struggles to see this change. It looks for buildings, not for behaviors. It looks for events, not for evolutions. And so the most important transformation in this story becomes the hardest one to notice. The palace disappears from the record, but not from life. Life simply no longer passes through it. This prepares us for the next question, the one that lingers behind this entire story. If such a profound change reshaped daily life, belief, and identity, why does it leave so little behind for us to find? Why does history remember the palace's walls, but not the world that grew beyond them? That question waits quietly in the background, asking us to look not at what was built, but at what was lived, and to consider whether the most meaningful changes are often the ones that leave the faintest marks. History is not an objective record of what happened. It is a record of what hurt. It remembers what burned, what broke, what bled, what collapsed suddenly enough to demand attention. It remembers moments when the world seemed to tear, when lives were interrupted, when stories were forced into existence by pain. These are the events that leave marks in the ground and in the mind, and because they leave marks, they become memories. The palace left none. There was no fire to blacken its walls, no massacre to scatter bodies across its floors, no siege to pile weapons against its gates, no moment of terror frozen into ash. Its ending did not wound anyone, and so it did not wound history either. This is why the palace feels invisible in the story of the past. Not because it did not matter, but because it did not hurt. Human memory is shaped by contrast. We notice the moment when something changes suddenly, not when it changes gradually. We remember the storm, not the slow shift of the wind. We remember the earthquake, not the erosion of the hill. We remember the scream, not the silence. The palace was silence, and silence does not echo through time. Storytellers did not gather around its ending because there was nothing dramatic to tell. No hero fell, no villain rose, no enemy was defeated, no city was saved or lost in a single night. There was only a long season of less, a quiet thinning of importance, a gentle drifting away. This does not feel like history, it feels like life. And life is rarely recorded. This is why the palace slipped out of collective memory so easily. It did not fail spectacularly enough to be remembered. It did not triumph loudly enough to be celebrated. It simply completed its role and faded. This creates a strange inversion. We tend to believe that what survives in history is what was most important. But often, what survives is simply what was most violent. The palace was neither, and so it became forgettable. This does not mean it was insignificant. It means it was peaceful, and peace does not carve itself into stone. The palace left no scar, and so it left no story. This does not mean no one noticed at the time. People noticed. They just did not narrate it. They did not mark it with dates or songs or monuments. They adjusted. They moved on. They lived. The palace did not vanish from the world. It vanished from attention. And attention is what turns events into history. Without attention, there is only continuity, and continuity feels invisible. This is the quiet tragedy of peaceful endings. They are kind to those who live through them, but cruel to those who want to remember them. They leave no sharp edges for memory to cling to. The palace's ending did not announce itself as an ending. It felt like a transition. It felt like a shift in habits, a change in priorities, a rearrangement of routines. People did not say, "This is over." They said, "This is different," and different does not always feel worth recording. History prefers before and after. It prefers clear lines. It prefers moments that can be pointed to. The palace offers none. It offers only a blur. And so it disappears. This is why we are tempted to search for catastrophe even when there was none. We look for fire because we know how to understand fire. We look for enemies because we know how to understand conflict. We look for collapse because we know how to mourn collapse. We do not know how to mourn peaceful change, so we forget it instead. The palace becomes a ghost not because it haunts us, but because it does not leave a trace loud enough for us to follow. This is what makes its silence feel so unsettling now. It challenges our idea of what matters. It suggests that the most influential changes may be the least visible ones. It suggests that what shapes the future is not always what shakes the present. And this realization leads us into the next layer of the story. If history itself is biased toward noise, then archaeology, which depends on physical traces, must be biased in the same way. It must favor what burns, breaks, and bleeds over what fades, drifts, and transforms. To understand the palace's disappearance fully, we must now look at how the ground remembers, how ruins speak, and how silence can be mistaken for nothing at all. The earth is not a neutral witness. It does not remember everything equally. It remembers what disturbs it. Fire bakes clay into permanence. Violence scatters objects into layers that can be traced. Collapse leaves shapes that do not belong, stones where they should not be, bones where life once moved. These disturbances are loud in the language of archaeology. They rise to the surface when soil is turned and time is peeled back. Silence does not. A peaceful ending leaves little behind. Rooms remain clean, walls remain standing, objects remain where they were last used, or are carried away gently. There is no dramatic layer to separate before from after. There is no line to draw, and without a line, it is hard to see that anything ended at all. This is the bias of ruins. It is not intentional, it is structural. Archaeology is a science of disruption. It notices what was broken, burned, buried, or abandoned suddenly. It struggles with what faded slowly. The palace is a perfect example. Its rooms were not filled with ash. Its halls were not crushed by falling roofs. Its people were not frozen into the soil by disaster. They simply stopped coming. From the ground's perspective, nothing happened. And when nothing happens, nothing is recorded. This creates a quiet tragedy in our understanding of the past. Entire ways of life may vanish without being recognized, simply because they did not collapse violently enough to leave a mark. We imagine history as a series of ruins, but ruins are only one kind of ending. The palace becomes a symbol of what we miss when we listen only for catastrophe. It shows us that our picture of the past is shaped not only by what occurred, but by what survived in a form we know how to read. We read fire, we read blood, we read broken walls and shattered tools. We do not read empty rooms very well. An empty room looks like nothing, but nothing can be the most meaningful thing of all. It can mean that people left calmly. It can mean that they took what they needed. It can mean that life moved elsewhere. But archaeology struggles to distinguish these meanings, because they all look the same in soil. Absence is ambiguous, and ambiguity is difficult to build stories from. So we default to what feels certain. We build narratives around destruction because destruction leaves clear evidence. We imagine invasions because invasions leave weapons. We imagine collapse because collapse leaves rubble. And when those things are missing, we assume nothing happened. The palace teaches us that something can happen without leaving a scar, and that something can be more important than a disaster. This reframing changes how we see not only this palace, but many other quiet gaps in the archaeological record. Places that seem insignificant because they left little behind. Periods that seem empty because nothing dramatic appears to have occurred. Perhaps they were not empty. Perhaps they were peaceful. Perhaps they were transitional. Perhaps they were alive in ways we no longer know how to recognize. This realization invites humility. It reminds us that we are not seeing the past itself. We are seeing its remains, and remains are always selective. They favor violence over peace. They favor collapse over continuity. They favor noise over silence. And because of that, our history is weighted toward tragedy. This does not mean tragedy was more common than peace. It means tragedy was louder than peace. The palace's disappearance is not unique. It is simply one of the rare cases where we notice that something is missing, and once we notice that, we begin to wonder how many other silences we have mistaken for emptiness, how many worlds ended gently, how many cultures reshaped themselves without leaving ruins, how many stories dissolved instead of breaking. We cannot easily answer these questions, because the ground does not speak in that language. It speaks in fractures and layers, not in transitions and adaptations. So we must learn to listen differently. We must learn to notice patterns of absence. We must learn to read what is not there. This is difficult. It requires patience. It requires imagination. It requires letting go of our attachment to dramatic endings. But it also opens a new way of understanding the past, not as a sequence of collapses, but as a series of transformations, not as a record of failure, but as a record of change. The palace is not a ruin. It is a pause in one form of life and the beginning of another. And this prepares us for the final turn of the story, where modern scholars begin to recognize this pattern, to question the old assumptions, and to listen for the silences that were once ignored. It is only then that the palace can truly be seen again, not as something that was destroyed, but as something that was quietly left behind. When archaeologists returned to the palace in the modern era, they did not arrive with the intention of finding silence. They arrived trained to look for noise. Their tools were designed to reveal fire, collapse, violence, and interruption. They expected to uncover layers that told a dramatic story, a sudden ending sealed into the earth by catastrophe. What they found instead felt strangely empty. The palace did not offer the familiar signs of collapse. There were no thick layers of ash, no roofs crushed inward by flames, no scattered weapons frozen into floors, and no skeletons pressed into corners by panic. The rooms were intact, the walls were steady, and the spaces were simply unused. And at first this felt disappointing, because there was nothing obvious to explain, nothing spectacular to point to, and nothing that fit the expectations of how important places end. Over time, archaeologists began to realize that what they were seeing was not nothing, but a pattern, and the pattern was absence. Storage rooms that once held large quantities of goods were empty but undisturbed. Repair projects were started but never finished. Pathways were worn smooth by use and then abruptly not worn at all. Objects were missing not because they were stolen, but because they had been carried away carefully. And this was not destruction, but departure. That realization changed everything, because instead of asking what destroyed this place, scholars began to ask why people left, and that question shifted the entire lens of interpretation. The palace stopped being a ruin and started being a trace of behavior. The ground stopped being evidence of disaster and became evidence of choice. And this was unsettling because archaeology had been built around the idea that civilizations end in moments, that collapse is sharp, sudden, and visible, and that when a society fails, it leaves behind a dramatic signature. Yet the palace offered no such signature, only stillness. This stillness was not empty but full of meaning, because it said that people did not flee, they did not run, they did not fight, and they did not die here. They simply stopped coming. And stopping is harder to see than breaking. The absence of fire meant there was no moment of panic. The absence of weapons meant there was no battle. And the absence of mass graves meant there was no massacre. So the palace did not end, it paused. And this pause challenged everything archaeologists thought they knew about how societies change. It suggested that not all endings are violent, that not all collapses are collapses, and that not all transformations leave scars. And because of that, the palace forced scholars to learn how to read silence. They had to notice what was missing instead of what was present, interpret empty rooms as information, treat unfinished walls as clues rather than mistakes, and see that the absence of chaos was itself a form of order. And this was not a discovery of new objects, but a discovery of a new way of seeing. That way of seeing slowly spread, and other sites were re-examined, other empty places reconsidered, and scholars began to ask whether some endings they had assumed were catastrophic might have been quiet instead, whether some ruins were not ruins at all but remnants of transitions. And the palace became a model for this reinterpretation, because it showed that a place could stop being used without being destroyed, that a system could end without collapsing, and that people could leave power behind without being forced. This did not make the story simpler but more complex, because it replaced clear villains with subtle shifts, battles with choices, and endings with transformations. And that complexity felt uncomfortable, because it did not fit the stories people liked to tell about the past, but it felt truer, and the palace was no longer a mystery of loss, but a mystery of change. And change is harder to narrate than disaster. Disaster has a shape, with a beginning, a climax, and an end, but change drifts, unfolds, and leaves traces that only become visible when viewed from far away. And this is why the palace had remained misunderstood for so long, because it did not speak the language of ruins, but the language of absence. And absence requires patience, noticing what is not there, and listening to silence. The archaeologists who learned to do this did not become hunters of destruction but listeners, listening to empty rooms, unbroken walls, undisturbed soil, and stillness. And in that stillness they heard a story that had been waiting quietly for centuries. Not a story of fire or war, but a story of people choosing differently, of a world rearranging itself, and of a palace that did not fall, but simply stepped out of the way. This new understanding did not just change how scholars saw the palace, it changed how they saw collapse itself, because it suggested that collapse is not always a failure, that sometimes it is a migration of meaning, a shift in values, or a quiet release. And this realization leads naturally into the next question, of how we should understand endings that do not look like endings at all, and how we should tell the story of change when change leaves no scars. Questions that now wait just beyond this discovery, ready to reshape not only the story of this palace, but the way we understand history itself. As scholars began to absorb what the palace was showing them, something subtle but profound shifted in the way they thought about history itself. For a long time, civilizations had been imagined as tall, rigid towers that either stood or fell, that either survived intact or collapsed into ruins. This image was simple, dramatic, and emotionally satisfying, but the palace did not fit inside it. The palace did not fall, and yet it clearly ended. It did not survive, and yet it was not destroyed. It had dissolved. This forced historians to consider a different kind of ending, one that did not involve catastrophe, invasion, or failure, but transformation. A civilization could reshape itself without breaking. A system could migrate into new forms without leaving behind a moment of collapse. The palace was not a victim of history. It was a stage within it. This reframing changed the emotional tone of the past. History stopped looking like a sequence of tragedies and began to look more like a sequence of transitions. Endings became softer. Loss became quieter. Change became less frightening. The palace did not lose a battle. It finished a chapter. This does not remove sorrow from history, but it redistributes it. It suggests that not all endings are wounds. Some are closures, some are releases, some are simply practical responses to a changing world. The palace was built to solve a specific set of problems in a specific time. When those problems changed, the solution changed too. This invites a gentler relationship with the past. Instead of mourning every disappearance as a failure, we can begin to see some disappearances as evolutions. Instead of asking why something ended, we can ask what it became. This shift also challenges how we think about progress. We are used to imagining progress as accumulation, as building more, bigger, faster, higher. The palace contradicts that idea. It shows that sometimes progress is subtraction. Sometimes progress is simplification. Sometimes progress is letting go of what once worked so that something else can emerge. This is uncomfortable because it threatens our attachment to growth as a value. We like to believe that the future is always a larger version of the past. The palace suggests that the future can also be a quieter version of the past. This realization gently unsettles us because it forces us to confront our emotional biases. We are drawn to dramatic stories because they feel meaningful. We are drawn to collapse because it feels like it matters. We are drawn to ruins because they are visible. Quiet endings feel thin by comparison, even when they are not. The palace asks us to question this instinct. It asks whether we mistake drama for importance and silence for insignificance. It asks whether our histories are shaped less by what happened and more by what felt emotionally intense. This does not mean that wars and disasters are unimportant. It means that they are not the only forces that shape the world. Beneath them, around them, and between them, slower currents are always moving, carrying societies into new forms without ever announcing their arrival. The palace reveals one of those currents. It shows that a society can outgrow a structure without rejecting it. It can leave something behind without destroying it. It can move forward without creating a ruin. This does not fit neatly into our narratives, because our narratives prefer conflict. They prefer heroes and villains, victories and defeats. The palace offers none of these. It offers only adaptation. And adaptation is harder to tell. It has no climax. It has no single moment of resolution. It unfolds over generations in small choices that feel insignificant, until they accumulate into something irreversible. The palace is a story of accumulation in reverse. This reframing does not make history less meaningful. It makes it more human. It shows that people shape the world not only through grand actions, but through ordinary ones. Through where they choose to live, how they choose to trade, what they choose to believe, and what they choose to let go of. The palace was not abandoned by a decree. It was abandoned by 1,000 quiet decisions. And those decisions were not wrong. They were responses. Responses to changing environments, changing values, changing needs. Seen this way, the palace is not a failure. It is a successful adaptation that has simply completed its work. This perspective also invites us to reflect on our own time. It encourages us to ask which of our own structures feel permanent, but may one day feel unnecessary. Which of our own institutions we cling to because they once mattered, not because they still do. It asks us whether we are prepared for endings that do not feel like endings. Whether we can recognize transformation when it does not announce itself. Whether we can accept change when it does not hurt. These questions are not historical. They are human. And this is why the palace becomes more than a site. It becomes a mirror. It reflects our assumptions about loss, progress, and memory back at us. It asks us whether we misunderstand the past because we expect it to behave like a story rather than like life. And in doing so, it prepares us to see the palace not just as a place that once existed, but as a symbol of how civilizations move, how cultures evolve, and how the most important changes often happen quietly, without witnesses, without scars, and without names. This is the story the palace tells when we finally learn how to listen to it. And this is the story that now carries us forward, from the physical remains of stone and soil into the deeper meanings those remains hold, toward a way of understanding the past that is not built on ruins alone, but on the living patterns of change that shape them. Once the palace is understood as a transformation rather than a failure, it becomes easier to see that its story is not unique. The world is filled with traces of societies that did not collapse in fire or fall to conquest, but simply drifted into new forms. They did not vanish in a moment. They thinned, spread, softened, and reshaped themselves until what they once were no longer existed as a single thing. Trade networks dissolve when routes become inconvenient. Cities empty when people find better places to live. Rituals fade when they no longer feel meaningful. Languages change when new generations find new ways to speak. None of this requires violence, leaves ruins, or demands attention, and yet all of it changes the world. These quiet endings rarely become history because they do not feel like endings. They feel like continuity. Life continues just slightly differently, and then slightly differently again, until the difference becomes so large that the past feels like another world. But because there was no moment of rupture, no one recorded the transition. There was no final day, no last speech, no dramatic farewell. There was only a gradual forgetting. This is why so many civilizations are not remembered as endings, but as absences. They are not known for how they stopped, but for how they are no longer there. The palace becomes a metaphor for all of them. It stands in for the villages that slowly emptied as people moved towards cities, for the towns that shrank when trade routes shifted, for the cultures that merged into others until their original forms were no longer visible, and for the ways of living that felt natural in one century and unnecessary in the next. None of these worlds ended badly. They ended quietly, and quiet endings do not survive. They do not survive in memory, story, or record. They dissolve. This creates a haunting sense that much of human history is missing, not because it was hidden or destroyed, but because it was gentle. The stories we know are shaped by pain. The stories we forget are shaped by peace. This is not because peace is unimportant, but because peace is invisible. We do not build monuments to transitions. We build monuments to victories and losses, so the world we remember is the world that broke, not the world that changed. The palace invites us to imagine how many other worlds we have lost, not to catastrophe, but to time. How many forms of life faded into others, without leaving behind names, ruins, or dates, and how many identities were absorbed, languages blended, and customs softened until what once felt distinct became part of something larger. None of this feels tragic when it is happening. It only feels strange when we look back and realize that something is gone. But gone is not the same as destroyed. Gone is often just transformed beyond recognition. This is why hidden history is not always hidden by intention. Sometimes it is hidden by subtlety, by the fact that it does not call attention to itself. by the fact that it does not hurt, and by the fact that it does not interrupt, and because of that, it slips through the cracks of memory. The palace is one of the rare moments when we catch that process in motion, when we see a world not ending in flames but dissolving into something else. This realization changes how we think about loss. It suggests that what we mourn is not always what was lost, but what we were able to notice. We notice ruins. We do not notice transitions. But transitions are what shape the long arc of humanity. They determine how people live, what they value, and what they carry forward. The palace reminds us that the most powerful changes may be the least visible ones, that history is not only made in moments of crisis, but in long periods of calm, that civilizations do not only fall, they flow, and that in that flow they leave behind very little that we know how to read. This is why the palace feels like a ghost, not because it is mysterious, but because it belongs to a pattern we rarely see, a pattern of gentle endings, soft disappearances, and worlds that did not shatter, but dissolved. Seeing this pattern forces us to reconsider what we think we know about the past. It invites us to imagine a history not dominated by disaster, but shaped by adaptation, not driven by collapse, but by change. And once we begin to see that, it becomes impossible not to turn that lens toward ourselves, to ask what in our own world feels permanent, but may one day feel unnecessary. What structures we rely on that future generations may quietly leave behind, and what parts of our lives may fade, not because they fail, but because they are gently replaced. That question waits just ahead, inviting us to move from the past into the present, and to recognize that the story of fading civilizations is not only ancient, but ongoing. Once we accept that civilizations can fade quietly, it becomes impossible not to turn that understanding toward ourselves. The palace no longer feels like something ancient and distant. It becomes a mirror, reflecting the patterns we live inside every day, and we begin to notice how many things in our own world feel permanent simply because they surround us, how many structures feel natural simply because we were born into them, and how rarely we question whether they will always remain. Our institutions feel solid because they have always been there in our lifetime. Our technologies feel inevitable because we use them constantly. Our systems of work, communication, governance, and belief feel foundational because we have built our identities around them. But history suggests that none of this is truly fixed. What feels essential now may feel unnecessary later, not because it fails, but because something else quietly takes its place. Future generations may one day walk through the remains of our own systems with the same curiosity we bring to ancient sites. They may stand inside empty offices, silent factories, abandoned data centers, or forgotten cities, and wonder why we needed them so badly, why we organized our lives around them, and why we eventually stopped. This is not a prediction of collapse. It is a recognition of change. Just as the palace once felt indispensable and then felt unnecessary, many things we depend on today may follow the same path, not suddenly and not violently, but gradually, as habits shift, needs evolve, and values change. This realization is not meant to frighten. It is meant to soften. It invites us to loosen our grip on permanence, and to see our world as a process rather than a structure. And it reminds us that what we are living inside now is not an endpoint, but a moment. This can feel unsettling at first because we like to believe that the systems we rely on are stable, that the ground beneath us is firm, and that the world is not always rearranging itself. But history suggests that it is always rearranging itself, just not always in ways we notice. The palace did not vanish in a storm. It faded in sunlight, and so may many things around us, not because they are weak, but because they are temporary, and temporary things can still matter deeply. We can love them, build them, and depend on them, but we do not need to believe that they will last forever in order for them to be valuable now. This perspective changes how we relate to our own lives. It encourages us to invest less in structures and more in relationships, less in permanence and more in presence, less in what we are building and more in how we are living, because when the structures fade, what remains are the lives that passed through them. The palace reminds us that history remembers buildings, but life remembers people, and people remember how it felt to live, and this is what endures. When future generations look back at us, they will not remember our technologies the way we do. They will not feel attached to our systems. They will see them as artifacts, not as necessities, but they may feel something familiar in our choices, and they may recognize the same hopes, the same fears, and the same desire for meaning and connection that shaped their own world. This is the bridge between ancient and modern life, not stone or structure, but humanity, and the palace becomes a reminder that we are not as different from the past as we imagine, and that the future will not be as different from us as we fear. We are all living inside our own version of a palace, whatever form it takes and whatever shape it holds, and one day, quietly and gently, without ceremony, we will leave it behind, not because it failed, but because something else will make more sense. This thought does not need to be heavy. It can be light. It can remind us to hold our world with care rather than control, to participate in it rather than cling to it, and to be present inside it rather than anxious about its future. The palace does not teach us that everything ends. It teaches us that everything changes, and change is not an enemy. It is the rhythm of life itself, and understanding this prepares us for the next part of the story, where we return to the palace, not to mourn what was lost, but to notice what was gained, to see how the quiet disappearance of a great structure created space for something more flexible, more resilient, and more human to grow in its place. When the palace finally loosened its hold on daily life, the change did not feel like collapse, but like release. There was no moment when people felt that something had been taken from them. There was a gradual sense that something had stopped pressing down. The palace had once organized resources, decisions, and meaning from above, and in doing so, it had created order, but it had also created dependence, and when that dependence softened, people did not feel lost. They felt lighter. Without a central authority controlling food, labor, and ritual, individuals and communities began to shape their own rhythms. They decided when to store and when to share. They chose how to work and with whom. And they marked time, not by palace calendars, but by seasons, weather, and need. Life became less efficient in a narrow sense, but more responsive in a broader one. And what was lost in coordination was gained in adaptability. This is the quiet strength of decentralization, because it does not maximize output, it maximizes survival. Centralized systems are powerful because they concentrate energy. They gather resources into one place and distribute them with intention, which allows for great projects, large populations, and impressive structures. But this concentration also creates fragility, because when something interrupts the flow, the whole system feels the strain. And when a single center fails, everything connected to it is affected. The palace was brilliant, but it was brittle. It required stability to function. It required predictable harvests, reliable trade, and shared belief. And when these conditions changed, the palace could not bend easily because it had been designed for a world that no longer existed. Decentralized life, by contrast, is not impressive. It does not build monuments, and it does not gather attention, but it is flexible. It bends with conditions. It shifts with weather, politics, belief, and need. And it does not collapse when one part fails because there is no single part that everything depends on. This is why decentralized life feels quieter, but lasts longer. It replaces grandeur with resilience, control with trust, and coordination with cooperation. And the palace fades, but life does not diminish. It transforms. People gain autonomy not in the sense of isolation, but in the sense of participation. They are not free from one another, they are free with one another, and responsibility moves closer to home, decisions become personal, and meaning becomes relational. This does not remove hardship. It changes how hardship is met. Instead of sending problems upward, people face them together. Instead of waiting for permission, people act. And instead of depending on distant systems, people depend on one another. And this creates a different kind of strength. Not the strength of domination, but the strength of connection. The palace had once offered security through structure, but the new world offered security through relationship. And neither is perfect. Both have costs, but only one can survive deep change. The palace could not survive because it was too good at what it did. It was too specialized, too efficient, and too centralized. While the new world survived because it was imperfect, redundant, adaptable, and able to change without breaking. This is the philosophical contrast at the heart of this transformation, because grandeur creates awe, and survival creates continuity. Control creates order, and freedom creates resilience, and the palace embodied order, while the new world embodied life. This is not a judgment, it is an observation, and it carries a quiet wisdom, because it suggests that what looks powerful is not always what lasts, and what looks small is not always what is weak. And the palace was strong, but the people were stronger, not because they could build higher walls, but because they could live without them. This is why losing a palace can mean gaining a life, not a larger life, and not a more impressive life, but a more human one. A life that belongs to those who live it, rather than to the structures that organize it. This realization does not glorify simplicity or condemn complexity. It simply shows that there is more than one way to survive, and that some ways leave fewer scars. And the palace did not leave ruins because it did not need to be destroyed. It was outgrown, and outgrowing something is gentler than breaking it. This gentleness is what makes the palace's disappearance feel peaceful rather than tragic. It is the feeling of stepping out of clothes that no longer fit, not because they are torn, but because you have changed. And that change does not end life. It deepens it. Understanding this prepares us to look next at how culture itself reshaped under these new conditions, how art, belief, and identity adapted when they were no longer framed by a single center, and how the quiet freedom that replaced the palace gave rise to new ways of being that were less visible, but no less meaningful. When the palace stopped shaping daily life, culture did not disappear with it. It simply changed its scale. What had once been centralized became local. What had once been formal became intimate. And what had once been imposed became shared. And this transformation did not feel like loss to those who lived inside it, because it felt like life finding a new way to express itself. Art no longer needed grand walls or royal patronage to exist. It appeared in homes, in tools, in clothing, in songs, and in small carvings shaped during quiet hours. And beauty moved closer to daily life, because it was no longer something people traveled to see, but something they lived with. Belief followed the same path, moving from monumental rituals into personal practices, and people spoke to the divine not only in temples but in fields, by rivers, and in their own thoughts. And faith became less about performance, and more about presence, woven into ordinary moments rather than reserved for special ones. Stories changed as well, no longer preserved by institutions or repeated by priests alone, but told around fires, passed from elders to children, and shaped by memory and feeling rather than by doctrine. And stories became flexible, evolving as people evolved. Identity shifted with these changes, and people defined themselves less by their relationship to a central power, and more by their relationships to one another and to their land, becoming known not as subjects but as neighbors, not as followers but as participants, and belonging became something felt rather than something assigned. This did not erase hierarchy entirely, because there were still elders, leaders, and respected voices. But authority was no longer distant. It was visible, familiar, and accountable, and it lived among the people rather than above them. Culture became less spectacular, but more resilient, because it could change without breaking, absorb new influences without losing itself, and grow quietly without needing permission. And this is why the palace could end without ending the people. The palace was a container, and the people were the water. And when the container changed, the water changed shape, but remained water. And this metaphor captures the heart of the transformation, because culture is not a structure, but a movement that flows through whatever forms are available and finds new ones when old ones disappear. This is what continuity looks like, not preservation of form, but preservation of life. And this gentle continuity is easy to miss, because it does not announce itself, demand attention, or create ruins, but it is what carries humanity forward. The palace becomes just one form among many that culture has taken, neither sacred nor shameful, simply one expression of human organization among countless others. And seeing this allows us to release the need to mourn its passing, and to see its ending not as an absence but as a transition. And transitions are not losses, they are movements. This understanding softens our relationship with the past, teaching us to honor what was, without clinging to it, to learn from what ended without needing to revive it, and to recognize that meaning does not live in structures, but in lives. The palace ends, but the people continue, and in continuing, they become something new, not better or worse, but different. And difference is not the enemy of continuity, it is its condition. This is why the story of the palace does not end in silence, but in movement, in hands shaping tools, in voices telling stories, in children learning from elders, and in lives being lived. The palace disappears from history because history remembers walls more easily than it remembers water. But water is what sustains life, and life is what history is actually about. This realization brings the story toward acceptance, not resignation or nostalgia, but a calm recognition that change is not a threat to meaning. It is the source of meaning. And we do not live inside monuments, but inside moments. And moments pass, but passing does not mean ending. It means continuing in another form, in another shape, and in another generation. And that is not loss. It is life. And this prepares us to turn toward the final reflections, not to ask what was destroyed, but to ask what remains, what echoes forward, and what this quiet story can teach us about our own lives, our own changes, and our own endings that may not be endings at all. The palace did not disappear without consequence, and its quiet absence became one of the most influential presences in the long story of Greece. Not as a memory, but as a condition, because by stepping out of the center of life, it created space, and that space did not remain empty. It filled with voices, experiments, disagreements, and ideas that could not have existed inside a single dominant structure. Without a central palace organizing everything from above, life in Greece became fragmented. And that fragmentation became fertile, because communities were no longer bound into one system, and instead became independent worlds, shaped by geography, temperament, and need. So coastal towns leaned into trade and navigation, inland settlements, refined agriculture and land management. Mountain communities developed strong local identities and forms of cooperation suited to isolation, and difference became normal. From this difference grew plurality, and from plurality grew conversation. Because when no single authority defines truth, many voices begin to speak. And when no single structure defines meaning, people begin to ask what meaning is. And this is not comfortable because it creates conflict, confusion, and uncertainty. But it also creates freedom, and freedom is where thought begins. The Greek world that followed the palace was not unified, but it was alive, and city-states emerged not as replacements for the palace, but as expressions of this new pattern, each becoming a center of its own with its own laws, customs, myths, and ambitions. So Athens was not Sparta, and Corinth was not Thebes, and identity became local, and loyalty became relational rather than hierarchical. This diversity did not weaken Greece, it energized it, because ideas could travel without being owned, practices could be tested without being imposed, experiments could fail without destroying everything. And some cities tried democracy, while others tried oligarchy. Some embraced trade, while others prized discipline or isolation, and Greece became a laboratory of human organization. This laboratory would not have been possible under a palace, because a palace demands coherence, requires alignment, and resists contradiction, while the absence of a palace allowed contradiction to exist. And contradiction is the engine of philosophy, because when people no longer live inside a single unquestioned system, they begin to ask questions, argue, reflect, doubt, and imagine alternatives. This is how philosophy emerges, not from certainty, but from uncertainty made safe. And the same is true of democracy, which does not grow where authority is unquestioned, but where authority is negotiated, where power is visible, disputable, and shared, and where no one structure feels inevitable. The palace's disappearance created exactly this condition, because power became local, decisions became communal, and leadership became accountable. Not as ideals at first, but as necessities, because people had to talk since no one else would decide for them, persuade since no one else would command, and listen since no one else would settle the question. And from this practice grew the habit of debate. From debate grew the idea of civic life, and from civic life grew the forms later named democracy. This did not happen quickly or intentionally. It emerged over time from the simple fact that people were living without a central voice telling them what was true, and this is what the palace made possible by leaving. Not a vacuum, but a clearing, a space where many things could grow. This reframes the palace not as a lost golden age, but as a necessary beginning, a stage rather than a destination, something that organized life long enough for society to mature beyond it. Like a scaffold that is meant to be removed. And scaffolds are not failures when they disappear, because they have done their work. The palace held society together while it was young, then it stepped away, and in stepping away, it allowed society to stand on its own. And this is why the palace's ending shaped Greece more than its existence, because its presence created order and its absence created possibility, and possibility is louder than order. The world that followed was noisy, argumentative, diverse, and unstable, but it was also creative, producing art, drama, philosophy, science, and politics that continue to shape how we think today. And none of this would have been possible inside a single palace, because it required space, disagreement, and silence, where a voice once spoke. The palace did not fall into history. It fell out of the way, and in falling out of the way, it allowed a civilization to find its own voice. And this is the deeper meaning of the palace's disappearance. Not an erasure, but a gesture that said, "Now it is your turn." And humanity answered, not perfectly, not peacefully, and not without conflict, but with creativity. And that creativity is what we remember as Greece. The quiet ending shaped the loud future, and that is why this story matters, because it shows that sometimes what ends is what makes something else possible. Sometimes silence is the condition for speech. Sometimes absence is the space where presence is born, and sometimes the most important thing a structure can do is to step aside. Disappearance is usually spoken of as loss, as if something has been removed from the world entirely, leaving behind a hole that can never be filled. But when we look closely at how the palace faded, that language begins to feel inadequate, because nothing was truly taken away, nothing was destroyed, and nothing was erased. Instead, something changed shape, moved location, and shifted meaning. And what we call disappearance was in fact a redistribution. The palace did not vanish into nothing. It dissolved into villages, into families, into daily routines, into habits of cooperation, into local beliefs and shared stories. And what had once been concentrated in one place spread outward into many places. So the palace became a network, and the network became a way of life. This is why disappearance can feel invisible, because it does not remove content from the world, it rearranges it, and rearrangement does not leave a gap, it leaves a new pattern. And if we are looking only for gaps, we miss the pattern entirely. History has trained us to look for breaks, for before and after, for moments when something stops and something else begins. But the palace teaches us that most endings do not have edges. They have gradients, and gradients are difficult to see because they do not announce themselves. The palace did not cross a line from existence into non-existence. It crossed a line from centrality into dispersion. And that crossing did not feel like loss to those who lived through it. It felt like life continuing somewhere else. This reframes the idea of disappearance itself, because disappearance does not mean absence, it means transformation, it means movement, it means continuity, wearing a new form. And once we see this, the story of the palace becomes less about what ended and more about what continued. This is why nothing truly vanishes, because energy changes form, matter changes location, and meaning changes context. But nothing becomes nothing. It only becomes something else. The palace became fields, homes, stories, and relationships, and those things became the foundation of the world that followed. And even though the palace no longer stands as a center, its influence remains woven into the fabric of daily life, hidden but present. This perspective changes how we relate to the past, because instead of seeing it as a cemetery of dead worlds, we can begin to see it as a river of change, carrying forms forward while constantly reshaping them. And what sinks does not disappear, it becomes part of the riverbed, shaping the flow of what comes next. The palace is not gone, it is everywhere. It is in the ways people organize themselves. It is in the habits of cooperation that survived it. It is in the preference for local life over distant authority, and it is in the shape of the world that grew beyond it. This does not make the palace immortal in a literal sense, but it makes it continuous in a human sense, because it lives on not as a building, but as a pattern. This is a quieter kind of survival, because it does not leave monuments, it leaves tendencies. It does not leave names, it leaves ways of being. This is harder to see, but more enduring, because stones fall, habits persist, walls crumble, and relationships continue. This is what disappearance really means. Not removal but diffusion, not ending but unfolding, and not death but change. This understanding gently shifts our emotional relationship with history, because if nothing truly vanishes, then loss is not an absolute. Endings are not final, and the past is not something that is gone, but something that is present in altered form. This does not mean we should deny grief or pretend that nothing is lost, because forms are lost, structures are lost, and specific ways of living are lost. But life itself continues, and that continuation is what matters. The palace mattered because of what it made possible, and it still matters because of what it became. Seeing disappearance this way allows us to hold change with less fear, because it allows us to see endings not as voids, but as transitions. And it allows us to trust that meaning is not fragile, that it does not depend on specific structures, and that it can survive movement. This prepares us for the final return to the palace itself, not as a center of power or as a ruin of tragedy, but as a symbol of how human life moves through forms, how it uses them, outgrows them, and carries their influence forward, even after they are gone. The palace is not the story, it is a chapter, and the chapter does not vanish when it ends. It becomes part of the book. This is the meaning of disappearance. It is not erasure, it is transformation. When we return to the palace at the end of the story, it no longer feels like a center, it feels like a margin, because the stones are still there, the walls still trace the outlines of rooms, corridors still open into one another, and light still moves across floors that once felt crowded with meaning. But nothing here pulls the world toward it anymore, and the palace stands without gravity. It is no longer a place of power, it is a place of questions, because each empty room asks what it once held, each doorway asks who once passed through, and each wall asks what it once supported beyond its own weight. And the palace does not speak through presence anymore, it speaks through absence, and absence is subtle. You can walk through the palace and see nothing unusual, because it looks like any other set of ruins, stones, space, and sky. But if you pause long enough, the silence begins to feel shaped, it feels intentional, and it feels like a form rather than a void. This is what the palace has become. Not a monument but a trace, not a command but a suggestion, not a memory but a question, and it does not tell you what happened, it invites you to wonder. This is why the palace has become invisible, not because it disappeared, but because it no longer asserts itself. It does not compete with the present, it does not demand reverence, and it does not offer spectacle. It waits, and waiting is easy to overlook. We are drawn to what shines, what moves, and what demands attention, and we pass by what rests, and the palace rests, and in resting it becomes a mirror that reflects our own habits of seeing, showing us what we notice and what we ignore, and revealing how easily we equate meaning with noise and importance with drama. The palace asks us to slow down, to listen, and to notice what remains when nothing is happening. And in that noticing, something shifts, because we begin to sense that the palace is not empty in the way we usually mean empty. It is empty of control, empty of hierarchy, and empty of spectacle. But it is full of implication, memory, and continuity, and it holds the shape of something that once mattered deeply and now matters differently. This is the final image. Not a ruin burning in sunset light, not a city swallowed by sand, and not a dramatic collapse frozen in time, but a quiet place where something ended gently, and gentle endings do not photograph well. They do not impress. They do not announce themselves, and they do not demand to be remembered, but they change the world anyway. The palace stands as proof that not all power leaves scars, and not all endings leave ruins worth preserving, because some leave only space, and space is where new life grows. This is what the palace gives us now, not answers but room. Room to think, room to feel, room to imagine, and room to question what we mean when we say that something is gone, because the palace is not gone, it is just no longer what it was. And that is not disappearance, it is transformation. This is the lesson hidden in the final image, that the world is not made of things that stay or things that vanish. It is made of things that change, and the palace changed, and we change, and everything changes. And in that change, meaning does not disappear. It moves, flows, and becomes something else. The palace is no longer a place where people live. It is a place where people wonder, and that may be its final form. A question, a pause, and a space where the past and the present touch lightly. If you stand there long enough, you may feel it, not as knowledge and not as certainty, but as a quiet awareness that the world is always in the middle of becoming something else, that nothing truly ends, that nothing truly vanishes, and that everything is part of a long, gentle movement. This movement includes us, because we are not separate from the story, we are inside it, we are shaping it, and we are being shaped by it. And the palace stands not behind us, but within us, as a reminder that what matters most is not what lasts forever, but what allows life to continue. This is the final image, a quiet place, an open question, and a gentle ending that is not an ending at all. It is simply the moment where one form gives way to another, and that is where the story rests. As the story draws to a close, the palace does not remain in front of us. It slips behind us, and in doing so, it leaves something quieter in its place. Not a conclusion, not a lesson, and not a moral, but a question. And that question is not loud enough to demand attention, but it is persistent enough to follow us after the story ends. If this palace could fade so gently, what else has faded with it? And what other worlds have ended without ceremony, without fire, without ruin, and without record? Not because they were unimportant, but because they were peaceful. And if so much of the past has passed this way, how much of what we think we know is shaped not by what happened, but by what made enough noise to be remembered? This is not an invitation to doubt everything, but an invitation to notice differently, to become aware of the silences between the events, the spaces between the stories, and the long stretches of time where life continued without leaving behind anything dramatic enough for us to hold on to. Perhaps history is not mostly a sequence of collapses, but a sequence of continuities that we have mistaken for nothing. And perhaps the world has been changing all along in ways that are too gentle to feel like change and too slow to feel like movement. If that is true, then what else have we forgotten? What cultures softened into others? What identities blended into new forms? What beliefs migrated into quieter practices? And what ways of living became invisible simply because they became ordinary? These questions do not accuse the past of hiding itself. They suggest that we may not yet have learned how to see it, and that our tools of memory are tuned to shock rather than to subtlety, to interruption rather than to flow, and to endings that hurt rather than to endings that heal. The palace becomes a symbol of this blindness, not because it is hidden, but because it is quiet, and quiet things are difficult to notice in a world that listens for noise. This does not make the palace mysterious in a supernatural sense. It makes it mysterious in a human one, because it reveals a gap not in the ground, but in our attention. And attention is what turns life into story. Without attention, life simply continues. This is why the palace vanishes again at the end of the story, not into ruin but into imagination, where it becomes a question rather than a thing, a presence rather than a place, and a reminder rather than a memory. It no longer asks what happened here. It asks what else has happened elsewhere. It no longer asks why this palace ended. It asks how many other endings we have missed. This question does not need an answer. It is not meant to be solved. It is meant to be carried. It is meant to follow you into quiet moments, into reflections, and into the spaces where stories settle. It is meant to open something rather than to close something. And so the story ends not with a period, but with an opening, not with certainty, but with curiosity, and not with resolution, but with awareness. Perhaps that is the most honest ending a story like this can offer. Not a claim about the past, but an invitation to look at the world more gently, to notice what fades, to listen for what is silent, and to recognize that what vanishes without a sound may still be shaping us in ways we do not yet understand. And in that recognition, the palace lives one last time, not as stone, not as structure, and not as history, but as a question that remains open, and that open question is where the story rests.